How would you feel if you boarded a plane and were told that it was one of the most advanced aircraft in the world? Most people would probably feel safer. After all, newer technology means better safety, better systems, and fewer chances of something going wrong. But what if the very thing that makes an aircraft advanced becomes the reason behind a disaster? What if the pilots themselves are still learning how to use the technology? And what if a small misunderstanding inside the cockpit turns into a tragedy that kills almost everyone on board? This is exactly what happened on the night of January 20th, 1992. An Airbus A320 operated by Air Inter was preparing for a short flight from Lyon to Strasbourg in France. The flight was expected to last only about an hour. Nothing seemed unusual. 90 passengers boarded the aircraft. Along with them were 4 cabin crew members and 2 pilots. The captain of the flight was Christian Heckett. He was an experienced pilot with thousands of flying hours. But there was one important detail. Although he had years of experience flying older aircraft, he had only recently started flying the Airbus A320. The first officer, Joel Cherubin, had even less experience on the aircraft. So while both pilots were qualified, neither of them had spent much time flying this new generation jet. At that time, the Airbus A320 was considered revolutionary. Unlike older aircraft, it relied heavily on computers. It had digital displays, advanced autopilot systems, and fly-by-wire controls. Many people believed it represented the future of aviation. Shortly after 6 p.m., Flight 148 took off from Lyon. The aircraft climbed normally and headed north toward Strasbourg. For the passengers, everything appeared routine. The cabin crew began serving snacks and drinks. The aircraft reached its cruising altitude, and for a while, nothing seemed wrong. But as the flight approached Strasbourg, the weather became an important factor. The area was experiencing strong winds, low clouds, and freezing drizzle. Because of these conditions, the pilots wanted to perform an ILS approach. An ILS approach is one of the safest ways to land an aircraft because it provides both horizontal and vertical guidance to the runway. In simple words, the system helps pilots know exactly where they are and whether they are too high or too low. But there was a problem. The runway that was currently active did not have an ILS system available. Instead, the pilots would have to perform a VOR approach. Unlike an ILS approach, a VOR approach only tells pilots whether they are left or right of the runway. It does not tell them whether they are too high or too low. That responsibility remains entirely with the pilots. The captain wasn't happy about this change. He preferred the approach he had originally planned. The first officer suggested a simpler solution, but the captain decided to continue with his own plan. This disagreement may not sound important, but accidents are often the result of many small decisions that seem harmless at the time. As the aircraft continued towards Strasbourg, air traffic control instructed the crew to descend. The pilots complied, but another problem started to develop. The aircraft was becoming too high and too fast for the approach. Controllers wanted them at 5,000 feet, but they were still much higher than that. Instead of informing air traffic control that they would struggle to meet the restriction, the pilots continued descending. To lose altitude more quickly, they increased their descent rate. Soon, the aircraft was descending at nearly 5,000 feet per minute. This was unusually steep, yet either pilot appeared concerned. Inside the cockpit, workload was increasing. The pilots were discussing procedures, changing navigation settings, monitoring weather, and preparing for landing. At the same time, communication between them was becoming less effective. Then came the critical moment. To perform the approach correctly, the pilots needed to select a descent angle of 3.3 degrees. The Airbus A320 had a special mode designed specifically for this purpose, but there was a catch. The aircraft could display information in 2 different modes. One mode showed descent angle, the other showed vertical speed, and the display looked very similar in both cases. When the captain entered a value of 3.3, he believed he was selecting a descent angle, but he wasn't. Instead, he had unknowingly selected a vertical speed of 3,300 feet per minute. This was nearly 4 times steeper than the descent they actually needed, and neither pilot noticed. The captain didn't announce the setting. The first officer didn't verify it, and the aircraft quietly began descending far faster than intended. What makes this even more frightening is that there were several clues that something was wrong. The aircraft's nose was unusually low.
Its descent rate was extremely high. The airspeed was increasing rapidly, and the aircraft was lower than it should have been. But both pilots were focused on another problem. They were concentrating on their horizontal position and trying to align with the runway. Because of this fixation, they failed to notice what was happening vertically. Then another crucial checkpoint was missed. According to their approach chart, at a certain distance from the airport, they should have been at approximately 4,300 feet. But when they reached that point, they were already hundreds of feet below the correct altitude. No one called out the error. No one questioned the descent. The aircraft continued downward. At this point, a mountain called Mount Santo Dio stood directly in front of them, hidden by darkness, hidden by cloud, and hidden from the pilots. Normally, a ground proximity warning system would alert pilots when terrain is approaching. Many aircraft already had this technology, but Air Inter had chosen not to install the system on their A320 fleet. As a result, there was no warning, no alarm, no voice telling the pilots to pull up, only silence. The passengers had no idea what was happening. The cabin crew had no idea what was happening. And even the pilots themselves didn't realize how serious the situation had become. Then suddenly, the aircraft's radio altimeter began announcing the distance from the ground. 200 feet. Moments later, traveling at almost 350 kilometers per hour, Flight 148 slammed directly into the side of Mount Santo Dio. The impact was devastating. Out of 96 people on board, 87 lost their lives. Only 9 survived. The crash shocked France. How could one of the world's most advanced aircraft fly directly into a mountain? Investigators spent months trying to answer that question. Eventually, they discovered that there wasn't one single cause. Instead, it was a chain of errors. Inexperienced pilots on a new aircraft, confusing cockpit design, poor communication, missed warning signs, and the absence of a terrain warning system. Each factor alone might not have caused an accident, but together, they created a disaster. After the crash, major changes were introduced throughout the aviation industry. Airbus redesigned parts of the cockpit displays. Pilot training procedures were improved. Ground proximity warning systems became mandatory, and airlines changed policies regarding pilot experience. Today, more than 30 years later, the Airbus A320 remains one of the safest aircraft ever built. But the story of Flight 148 serves as a reminder that even the most advanced technology cannot eliminate human error. Sometimes, a disaster doesn't begin with a major failure. Sometimes, it begins with a small misunderstanding. A misunderstanding that nobody notices until it's too late.